October 23, 1933, 2:14 a.m., at derelict safe house on the outskirts of Joplin, Missouri. The sound of a heavy rain hitting the corrugated iron roof was the only thing masking the metallic click of Bonnie Parker's Remington Model 8. She sat by the window, the amber glow of a dying cigarette illuminating the burns on her leg, remnants of a stolen car's battery acid explosion months prior. Opposite her, Clyde Barrow was cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife, his eyes never leaving the heavy oak door. Then, the sound, a rhythmic knocking, 3 slow, 2 fast. The sound moment of a signal that shouldn't have been used tonight. "He's early," Clyde whispered, the tension in his jaw visible in the dim light. "He's not alone." They were the most hunted couple in America, living on a diet of cold beans, adrenaline, and the constant smell of burnt gunpowder. But tonight, the threat wasn't a sheriff's posse. It was a deal. To understand how the most notorious outlaws in history ended up in a room with a mid-level Chicago outfit representative, we have to look back at the bleeding coffers of the Barrow gang. They were out of ammunition, out of allies, and running out of road. The door creaked open. Enter Silas the Ghent Vane, a man whose silk suit cost more than the Ford V8 Clyde had boosted in Kansas. But Silas didn't bring a briefcase of cash. He brought a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19, shivering in a thin floral dress, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed the fear of the law. "This is my daughter Alina," Silas said, his voice as cold as the Missouri rain. "She's your insurance. You take the shipment of bank bonds to Chicago, and she stays with you. If you get caught, I use my connections to clear your path. If you betray me, well, you know I'd kill my own blood to keep my books clean." Bonnie looked at the girl, then at Clyde. The legend effect was already simmering. Nobody knew that night that the girl wasn't just leverage. She was a ticking time bomb. The mistake wasn't taking the job. It was believing a father wouldn't set a trap using his own heart. The cost of survival was about to become a debt they couldn't pay. October 23, 1933, 4:30 a.m. Highway 66, heading northeast. The interior of the stolen sedan smelled of damp wool and Elena's cheap lavender perfume. Clyde drove with a frantic precision, weaving through the back roads to avoid the loud dogs he knew were sniffing the main arteries. In the back seat, Bonnie watched Alina. The girl hadn't spoken a word. She just clutched a small leather valise, as if it contained her soul. 2 weeks earlier, the Barrow gang had been cornered in a shootout that left 2 officers dead and their reputation as Robin Hoods shattered. They were desperate. Silas Vane knew this. He was a man who played chess while others played poker. He knew Clyde's weakness wasn't greed. It was the misplaced sense of Southern chivalry that still flickered under his scarred exterior. "Your father is a snake, honey," Bonnie said, lighting another cigarette. The smoke swirled in the cramped cabin. "You know that, right?" Alina finally looked up. Her voice was a mere ghost of a sound. "He's not a snake. He's a businessman. And right now, I'm the only currency he has left that hasn't been inflated by the FBI." The car hit a pothole, and the sound of metal scraping asphalt echoed like a gunshot. Clyde cursed, pulling onto a dirt shoulder under a canopy of weeping willows. The darkness was absolute, save for the flickering dashboard lights. This was the first test of their logistics. They needed to switch plates, but the lug nuts were rusted shut. Clyde stepped out into the mud, the cold air hitting him like a physical blow. He felt the weight of the situation. They weren't just transporting bonds. They were transporting a human shield that Silas could claim was kidnapped the moment things went south. It was a masterpiece of criminal strategy. Silas remained the grieving father, while the outlaws took the fall for a high-profile abduction. "He's 2 steps ahead," Clyde muttered, wrestling with the wrench. The sound of a distant siren began to rise from the valley. It wasn't close, but in the silence of the Missouri woods, it sounded like a funeral march. Trust is a luxury the dying can't afford, and Alina was starting to look like the executioner. October 24, 1933, 1:15 a.m. A roadside diner, Missouri-Illinois border. The Neon Swallow was a place where questions went to die. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and fried onions. Bonnie sat at the far booth, her hand resting on that tucked .38 tucked into her waistband. Alina sat across from her, picking at a plate of cold eggs. Clyde was outside, scouting the perimeter, blending into the shadows of the parked trucks. The context of this meeting was hidden in Silas Vane's history. He wasn't just a mobster. He was a fixer for the corrupt political machine in Chicago. The bank bonds they carried were evidence of a massive embezzlement scheme that could topple a senator. By giving them Alina, Silas wasn't just providing leverage, he was ensuring that if the police stopped the car, the headlines would scream kidnapping instead of political scandal. "Why didn't you run?" Bonnie asked suddenly. "When he handed you over in that shack, why didn't you scream?" Alina looked Bonnie in the eye, a strange flash of defiance appearing. "Where would I go?" "To the police. They're on his payroll. To my mother. She's buried in his cemetery Silas owns. I'm a ghost. Mrs. Parker, just like you." The bell above the door rang. A man in a tan trench coat walked in, shaking the rain off his hat. His eyes scanned the room with a professional coldness. A Pinkerton. The Barrow Gang's reputation for being untouchable was being tested by men who didn't care about legends, they cared about bounties. Bonnie didn't panic. She reached for the sugar shaker, her movements fluid and calm. "Clyde," she whispered into the small radio transmitter. They had rigged a rare piece of tech Clyde had stolen from a police supply depot. Outside, the sound of a car engine revving signaled the start of a tactical retreat. The decision was made. They couldn't stay in the light. They had to move into the heart of the storm. The error wasn't trying to outrun the law. It was forgetting that the law sometimes wore a fedora and a badge of private interest. October 24th, 1933, 11:50 p.m., an abandoned brewery, Southside Chicago. The smell of hops and rot filled the air. This was the dead zone, a part of the city where even the local precinct didn't venture after dark. Clyde pulled the Ford into the loading bay, the tires crunching on broken glass. The atmosphere was heavy with the legend effect, the feeling that history was being written in the shadows. They were here to meet Silas's contact, a man known only as the Butcher. But the tension was different now. Alina had started talking. She told him about the red ledger her father kept, a book that contained every bribe, every hit, and every betrayal Silas had ever committed. And she told him it was hidden in the very valise she was clutching. "He didn't give me to you as leverage," Alina hissed, her voice trembling. "He gave me to you so you would take this ledger to Chicago. He's selling out the outfit to the feds in exchange for immunity. He's using Bonnie and Clyde to do his dirty work because he knows the police won't stop your car, they'll just shoot it." The realization hit Clyde like a lead pipe. They weren't messengers, they were the distraction. Silas wanted them to be caught or killed with the ledger in the car. It would look like they stole it. The legend of Bonnie and Clyde would be the perfect cover for Silas's betrayal of the Chicago mob. Suddenly, the brewery's floodlights snapped on. "Drop the bag, Barrow," a voice boomed from the catwalks. It wasn't the police, it was the outfit. They had been tipped off that the Barrow Gang was coming to town with their death warrant. Clyde grabbed his Browning automatic rifle bar. "Bonnie, get the girl down." The first volley of gunfire shattered the windshield. The sound was deafening, a rhythmic, violent percussion that signaled the end of the business deal. In the game of power, family is just another pawn to be sacrificed for the king. October 25th, 1933, 0:05 a.m. inside the brewery, Chicago. The bar roared. It's heavy, 30-06 rounds punching through the wooden crates where the outfit gunmen were hiding. Clyde moved with a terrifying fluidity, a man who had spent his life in the crosshairs. Bonnie was right beside him, firing her pistol with a steady hand, her eyes focused on the exit. Alina was huddled behind a rusted copper vat, the leather valise pressed to her chest. This was the legend in action, the sheer, desperate violence that made Bonnie and Clyde household names. But this wasn't a bank heist. This was a fight for survival against a professional army. "We're being pinned," Bonnie yelled over the din. "We need a way out, Clyde." Clyde saw a heavy delivery truck parked near the back. It was an old Mack, built like a tank. The truck. "Move now." They sprinted through a hail of bullets. A round grazed Bonnie's shoulder, tearing through the fabric of her coat and drawing blood. She didn't scream. She just gritted her teeth and kept firing. They reached the truck, Clyde hot-wiring the ignition in seconds, skill honed through years of theft. As the engine groaned to life, Alina looked at the valise. She knew what was inside. She knew that if they escaped with it, her father was a dead man. But if they stayed, they were all dead. She made a choice. She threw the valise into the furnace of the brewery's old boiler as they sped past. "What did you do?" Clyde roared as they smashed through the loading dock doors into the rainy Chicago night. "I ended it," Alina said, her face pale. "He doesn't get to win. None of you do." The decision was a blow to their leverage. Now they had no bonds, no ledger, and a very angry mob behind them. The cost of a clean conscience is often a target on your back. October 25th, 1933, 3:20 a.m., Cicero, Illinois. The rain had turned into a cold mist that clung to the brick houses of Cicero. They found shelter in a garage owned by an old Contact-Ecclesia man who owed him a favor from their days in the Eastham State Farm. The air smelled of oil and old hay. Bonnie was patching her shoulder, the sting of the antiseptic making her eyes water. "You burned the only thing keeping us alive," Clyde said, pacing the length of the garage. "The outfit thinks we have that ledger. Silas thinks we have that ledger. Every gun in this city is pointed at this garage right now." Elena sat on a crate, her spirit seemingly broken. "My father will come for me, not because he loves me, but because he needs to know the ledger is gone. He'll come alone to negotiate. He's too arrogant to let his subordinates know he lost it." This was the chess move. They had to lure Silas into the open. But to do it, they needed to play on his one weakness, his reputation. In the criminal underworld, being seen as a man who lost control of his own daughter and his secrets was a death sentence. Bonnie looked at Elena. There was a weird sort of bond forming between the outlaw and the socialite. Both were trapped by the men in their lives. Both were running from a destiny they couldn't control. "We use the radio," Bonnie suggested. "We put out a word through the underworld channels. We tell them we're holding the girl for $1 million ransom." It was a bold, dangerous move. It would bring the police, the mob, and Silas all to one spot. "It's a suicide mission," Clyde whispered. "We're already dead, Clyde," Bonnie replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "We've been dead since Texas. Let's just choose how we go out." The legend wasn't about living forever. It was about making sure they remembered the name. October 25th, 1933, 9 a.m., a payphone in a foggy park. Clyde dropped a nickel into the slot. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his voice was steady. He called Silas's private liner number Elena had provided. "I have your daughter, Silas," Clyde said, the legend effect thickening his tone. "And I have your book. The one with the red leather, the one that says you're a rat." On the other end, the silence was heavy. Silas Vane, the man who thought he could use the most dangerous couple in America as pawns, was finally realizing he had invited wolves into his house. "Where?" Silas finally asked. "The old Lakeside Observatory. Midnight. Come alone, or I start mailing pieces of the ledger to the Chicago Tribune, and maybe a lock of Elena's hair to the outfit's boss." Clyde hung up. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He wasn't afraid of Silas. He was afraid of the trap Silas was undoubtedly setting. Silas wouldn't come alone. He'd bring a hit squad. But Clyde knew the terrain of the observatory. It was a labyrinth of marble and glass, perfect for a couple who knew how to disappear in the shadows. Back at the garage, Bonnie was teaching Elena how to load a Colt .45. Thumb down, slide back. Don't think about the person. Think about the target. Elena's hands were steady now. The terror had been replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She was no longer a piece of leverage. She was a participant. The moral theme was becoming clear. Loyalty to blood was a lie, and the only real family was the one you bled with. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave the city breathless. October 26th, 1933, 11:45 p.m., Lakeside, Chicago. The observatory sat on a cliff overlooking Lake Michigan. The wind howled through the stone pillars, sounding like a choir of ghosts. It was a cold, brutal night. Bonnie was positioned in the dome, her rifle aimed at the long driveway. Clyde and Elena were on the ground floor, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. A single black limousine pulled up. The headlights cut through the fog like twin blades. Silas Vane stepped out. He looked smaller than he had in Missouri, swallowed by his heavy overcoat. He carried a leather briefcase. "I'm here," Silas shouted, his voice whipped away by the wind. "Bring me my daughter and the book." Clyde stepped out into the moonlight. He looked like a spectre, thin, pale, and carrying a bar like it was an extension of his arm. "The book is safe, Silas, but your daughter. She's got a few things to say to you first." Elena stepped out from behind Clyde. She didn't look like the girl in the floral dress anymore. She was wearing one of Bonnie's barrettes and a dark trench coat. She looked like an outlaw. "You tried to kill me, Dad," she said, her voice echoing in the marble hall. "You sent me with them, knowing they were marked for death. You wanted me to be a casualty of the Barrow gang." Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You were always a poor investment, Elena. But the ledger? That's worth more than a dozen daughters." That was when the shadows moved. Silas hadn't come alone. From the darkness of the trees, 6 men with Thompson submachine guns emerged. The gent had brought an army to a knife fight. October 27, 1933, 0:05 a.m. The observatory. The first burst of Tommy gunfire shattered the massive glass lens of the telescope. Shards of glass rained down like diamonds, cutting into Silas's face. He screamed, clutching his eyes. "Now, Bonnie!" Clyde yelled. From the dome, Bonnie opened fire. Her Remington barked, picking off the gunman in the driveway with surgical precision. The legend effect was at its peak, the sheer audacity of 2 people taking on a mob hit squad in a landmark building. Clyde pushed Alina toward the back exit. "Run to the car. Don't look back." But Alina didn't run. She saw her father crawling toward the briefcase he had dropped. She saw the man who had sold her life for a ledger that no longer existed. She picked up the Colt .45 Bonnie had given her. The sounds of the battle were a chaotic symphony, the heavy thump of the bar, the rat-tat-tat of the Thompsons, and the crashing of marble. Clyde was moving from pillar to pillar, a ghost in the smoke. He was 2 steps ahead, using the acoustics of the hall to make the gunmen think there were 10 of him. One of the gunmen managed to get a clear shot at Clyde. He leveled his weapon. His finger tightening on the trigger, cracked a single shot from a .45, echoed through the hall. The gunman fell, a hole in his chest. Alina stood there, the gun smoking in her hand. She had made her choice. She had crossed the line from victim to criminal. Bonnie descended from the dome, her shoulder bleeding again, but her eyes burning with triumph. "We have to go. The cops are coming." They scrambled for the Ford, leaving a trail of blood and broken glass behind them. Silas Vane was left on the floor of the observatory, blinded and broken, with no daughter and no ledger to save him from the outfit's wrath. The gent was about to learn that leverage only works if you have something left to lose. October 27, 1933, 5 a.m. The outskirts of Chicago. His sun was beginning to rise, a pale, sickly yellow over the Illinois cornfields. The Ford was battered, its windows gone, its body riddled with bullet holes. Inside, the 3 of them were silent. They dropped Alina off at a small train station in a town where no one knew her name. Clyde handed her a roll of cash enough to get to California, or at least far enough away from the name Vane. "Why did you help us?" Alina asked, looking at Bonnie. Bonnie looked at Clyde, then back at the girl. "Because everyone thinks we're monsters, honey, and maybe we are. But even monsters don't like seeing a father sell his kid." Alina watched the Ford disappear into the morning mist. She was free, but she was haunted. Silas Vane was found by the outfit 3 hours later. He didn't survive the interrogation. The Red Ledger became a legend of its own, a ghost story whispered in the back rooms of Chicago for decades. Bonnie and Clyde drove on. They knew their time was short. They knew the Arcadia they were looking for didn't exist in this life. But for one night, they weren't just outlaws, they were the ones who broke the house. This story, like many involving the Barrow Gang, is a mixture of blood and myth. But the records show a high-profile shooting at an Illinois observatory in late '33 that the police tried to bury. They say a girl was involved. They say she vanished. What would you have done? Would you have stayed a pawn in a father's game? Or would you have picked up the gun and joined the legend? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. If you enjoyed this dive into the dark history of the Barrow Gang, hit the like button and subscribe for more cinematic true crime. The road only gets darker from here.